Have you ever watched something, or someone, fight to hold on to what belongs to them, only to realize that the real protection was never coming from them at all? There are moments in life that strip away every illusion of control. Moments where the plans of powerful people, the decisions of entire communities, the force of collective human will, all of it runs directly into something it cannot move, cannot reason with, cannot override. And in those moments, the question that rises to the surface is not who is stronger or who has more authority. The question is something older and more unsettling than either of those. Who actually decides? This is a story about exactly that kind of moment. And what you are about to discover may change the way you think about power, about belonging, and about the invisible forces that sometimes move beneath the surface of what we can see and explain. A whole village made a decision. Not one person, not a small group of dissenters, an entire community, speaking with a single voice, arriving at a single conclusion. The child had to go. The reasons, in the logic of the village, were reasonable enough. They told themselves the right stories, used the right words, organized themselves with the kind of collective certainty that makes human groups feel justified in almost anything. They were not, in their own minds, doing something wrong. They were doing what needed to be done. And then they tried to do it. And something appeared. Stay with me, because this is the part that nobody in that village ever fully recovered from. There is something deeply destabilizing about the experience of reaching for something and finding that your hand simply will not arrive. Not because of physical resistance, not because someone stronger pushed back, not because a wall appeared where there was none before, but because the space between intention and action suddenly became impossible to cross. Like trying to walk forward in a dream and discovering that the ground beneath you has a different set of rules than the ground you thought you were standing on. The people of that village knew force. They understood resistance. They had encountered opposition before, and they knew how to press through it, with persistence, with numbers, with the particular brand of confidence that comes from believing you are on the right side of a decision. What they did not know how to process was what they encountered that day. Because what stopped them was not opposition in any form they recognized. What stopped them could not be argued with, negotiated with, intimidated, or outlasted. It simply was. Present, certain, and completely unmoved by everything they brought to bear against it. Have you ever felt something like that? A moment where you were absolutely certain you were about to lose something, or someone, and then, without explanation, the loss simply didn't come. Where the thing that should have happened failed to happen, and you were left standing in the strange quiet of an outcome that defied every available prediction. What you are going to hear in this video is not a comfortable story. It is not the kind of story that resolves neatly or hands you a simple moral and sends you on your way. It is the kind that settles into you slowly, that you find yourself turning over days later, asking questions you didn't know you had. Because the real mystery here is not what appeared when they tried to take the child. The key, real mystery is what that appearance reveals about the child herself, about what she carried, what surrounded her, and why no human decision, however unanimous, however forceful, was ever going to be the one that determined her fate. That is exactly where we are going. And perhaps that is what makes this story so difficult to set down once you have picked it up, because it does not stay neatly inside the boundaries of someone else's experience. It has a way of reaching through the screen and touching something in your own history. Some moment, some near miss, some inexplicable turn of events that you filed away under luck or coincidence because no other category was available to you at the time. But what if there was another category? What if the filing system you were given was simply missing a drawer? There are people watching this right now who know exactly what I am talking about, not because they read it somewhere or heard someone describe it, but because they lived it, because there was a moment, or more than one moment, where something intervened in their story in a way that did not follow the rules of the world as they had been taught to understand it. Where the outcome that everyone expected, including perhaps themselves, simply failed to materialize. And they moved forward carrying that unexplained thing quietly, the way you carry something you don't have a box for, not quite able to put it down, not quite sure where it belongs. If that is you, if something in these words is landing in a place that feels personal, I want to hear from you. Scroll down to the comments right now and tell me, has there ever been a moment in your life where something should have been taken from you and wasn't? Where a door should have closed and didn't? Where the force that came for something you belonged to simply could not finish what it started? You do not need to explain the whole story. A few words is enough. This is a space where those experiences are taken seriously, where they are not met with rational dismissal or polite skepticism, but with the recognition they deserve. Your comment does more than you might think. It reaches someone else who is watching this in silence, who has never told anyone about their own version of this story, and who needs to see proof that they are not alone in having lived it. That is the real power of a comment, not the algorithm, not the engagement metric, but the human chain it creates. One person's honesty, giving another person permission to be honest too. And if this content is the kind you want more of, if this is the register you have been looking for and not quite finding, then please like this video. It is the simplest signal you can send, and it carries real weight in terms of getting this kind of storytelling in front of the people who need it. One tap. That is all it takes to say, this matters, and it should reach further. If you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment. This channel is built around exactly this kind of content. The stories that ask the questions most conversations are too rushed or too cautious to ask. The ones that take the unexplained seriously without turning it into spectacle. If that is the kind of journey you want to be on, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the next time something like this arrives here, you deserve to be in the room for it. Your presence in this community is what makes it possible to keep going deeper. Every subscriber, every comment, every like is a real person saying, yes, go further. And so we go further. Because what happened in that village, what appeared when they tried to take the child, and what it revealed about who she actually was, is a story that is only just beginning to unfold. To understand what happened that day, to really understand it, in the way that goes beneath the surface of the event itself and reaches the deeper structure of what it meant, you have to first understand the village, not just as a setting, not as background scenery for a story that could have happened anywhere. You have to understand it as a living thing, with its own logic, its own immune system, its own deeply encoded sense of what belonged and what did not. Because what the village did that day was not an aberration. It was not a moment of collective madness or temporary moral failure. It was the village functioning exactly as it had always functioned, as a system designed to protect itself, to maintain coherence, to identify and address whatever it perceived as a threat to its internal order. Villages like this one, and they exist in every culture, in every era, in every variation of human community that has ever organized itself around shared land and shared survival, operate according to principles that predate written law, formal governance, and the individual rights frameworks that modern people take for granted. The principles are simpler and older than any of that. They are the principles of the collective organism. What serves the group is right, what threatens the group is wrong, and the group's judgment about which is not subject to appeal. This was a community with deep roots, the kind that goes down farther than living memory, farther than the oldest person in the village could account for, down into the layer of time where history becomes myth and myth becomes the bedrock of identity. The traditions here were not arbitrary customs observed out of habit. They were load-bearing structures. They held the social architecture in place the way a foundation holds a building, invisibly, completely, and with consequences for everything above them if they were ever allowed to shift. Decisions in this village were not made lightly. They went through a process that had been refined over generations, a process of discussion, of consultation with the oldest members, of reading the available signs, of reaching a consensus that everyone could, if not you, fully embrace, at minimum accept. The process was slow, and it was thorough, and it was taken seriously by everyone who participated in it. When the village arrived at a conclusion together, that conclusion carried a weight that no individual voice could easily counter. To disagree with the collective decision was not simply to hold a different opinion. It was to place yourself outside the community's understanding of what was true. It was a form of social exile that most people were not willing to risk. And so when the elders gathered, when the fire was built, and the circle was formed, and the long conversation began, nobody in the village doubted that what emerged from it would be final. This was how things had always worked. This was how things would continue to work. The process was the guarantee. The process was the thing that separated their community from chaos, from the unpredictable, ungoverned space where individuals made their own judgments without accountability to the whole. The conversation that led to the decision about the child had been building for a long time. It did not begin the night of the gathering. It began in whispers, in the small, sideways conversations that happen at the edges of daily life, in the pauses between tasks, in the particular quality of silence that descends when a subject is present in a room but not yet spoken aloud. People had been watching her for months, noting things, collecting observations the way you collect evidence when you are building a case you are not yet ready to present. She was different. This was the beginning of everything, and it was stated so consistently by so many different people that it had the quality of established fact rather than opinion. Different in ways that were easy to list but somehow unsatisfying to examine too closely. She did not play the way the other children played. She did not respond to things the way the other children responded. She was quiet in circumstances that called for noise and calm in circumstances that called for fear. These were small things, individually, but they accumulated. And in a community where coherence was survival, difference was never simply difference. It was always also a question that asked, if this person does not follow the rules that hold us together, what does that mean for the rules? The fear the village felt toward her was not the simple fear of the unknown, though that was part of it. It was something more specific. It was the fear that a community feels when it encounters something it cannot classify, something that does not fit into any of its existing categories, something that sits at the edge of the known map and looks back at you with eyes that are not hostile but are also not fully legible. She had never done anything to hurt anyone. Nobody could point to a specific harm she had caused, a specific rule she had broken, a specific act that would have justified the decision in any straightforward moral ledger. But the unease she generated was real, and in the arithmetic of collective fear, unease is often sufficient. She was isolated by degrees, not through any single act of exclusion, but through the slow accumulation of small withdrawals. The playmate who stopped coming, the invitation that was not extended, the space that opened around her at the fire in the evenings as other people quietly shifted toward each other and away from her. She probably felt it before she understood it. Children always do. The body registers rejection before the mind has the vocabulary for it. She would have experienced it as a change in the temperature of the world, a gradual cooling, a quality of attention that had once been warm and had slowly, without announcement, become careful. And careful attention is its own kind of punishment. To be looked at carefully, to be watched rather than simply seen, assessed rather than simply known, is to be made into a problem. She became, in the village's collective perception, a problem to be solved. And the solution, when it finally arrived at the end of that long evening's conversation around the fire, had the terrible clarity of something that everyone had been moving toward without quite admitting it. She would have to leave. Not in anger, not with cruelty. The elders were careful to frame it in the language of necessity rather than judgment. It was not that she was bad. It was that she did not belong here. It was not that anyone wished her harm. It was that the discomfort her presence generated in the community was a kind of harm in itself, a low-grade, persistent harm to the collective sense of coherence that the village could not continue to absorb indefinitely. The decision was made with the specific moral solemnity of people who believe they are doing a difficult but necessary thing. And that framing, the framing of reluctant necessity, made it, in their minds, unchallengeable. Nobody spoke against it openly. This is the detail that matters most in understanding what the decision actually was. Because there were people in that circle who felt uncertain. There were people whose bodies registered something wrong in the conclusion, even as their mouths stayed closed. The woman who had once brought food to the child's mother when she was ill. The man who had noticed on more than one occasion that the child had a quality of perception that he could not fully explain, but that he had found privately remarkable. The older girl who had sat beside her once at the edge of the water and felt for those few minutes a peace that she had not felt before or since. They said nothing. The weight of the collective was too heavy. The momentum of the consensus was too strong. And in saying nothing, in allowing their private doubts to be swallowed by the silence of compliance, they participated in the decision as fully as those who had spoken in favor of it. This is how communities do their worst things. Not usually, through the actions of people who feel nothing. Usually through the silence of people who feel something but have calculated that the cost of speaking is too high. The decision was announced. The process moved to the next stage. A group was designated to carry it out, not the elders themselves, but a small number of the village's steadiest adults, people known for their composure, their reliability, their ability to do what was required without being undone by the doing of it. They were given a morning. They prepared themselves the way people prepare for an unpleasant but necessary task, with practicality, with a forward-leaning determination to get to the other side of it as quickly and cleanly as possible. The morning arrived with a particular quality of light that comes after a night of unease, sharp and clear and slightly too bright, the kind of light that makes every detail more present than you want it to be. The group assembled. They moved through the village with the collective purposefulness of people executing a plan, and the village watched them go with the specific silence of a community that has committed to something and is now waiting for the commitment to be completed. The path to where the child was took them through the outer edge of the settlement, past the last of the familiar structures, and into the transitional space between the village and the tree line. That zone that was neither fully domesticated nor fully wild, where the human and the non-human orders met and negotiated their boundary. It was ordinary terrain, walked regularly, known well. There was nothing unusual about it on any other morning. But on this morning, as the group moved into it with their collective intention and their collective certainty, the ordinary landscape began to behave differently. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of obvious theatrical transformation that stories sometimes use to signal a change. More subtly than that. A quality of attention in the air, the way air sometimes feels before a storm. Not threatening exactly, but charged. Aware of itself in a way that ordinary air is not. Several of the people in the group noticed it and said nothing, each assuming the sensation was private, each attributing it to the weight of what they were about to do rather than to anything in the environment itself. They were still telling themselves that story when the wolf appeared. It came from the tree line without hurry. This was the first thing. That registered, not its size, not its eyes, not any of the qualities that would dominate the recollection of everyone present for the rest of their lives. The first thing that registered was the absence of hurry. A wolf appearing at the edge of human settlement had no logical reason to move without urgency. The ordinary calculus of the encounter should have produced hesitation, wariness, the ready-to-run tension of an animal that knows it is outnumbered. None of that was present. It moved the way something moves when it has already assessed the situation and arrived at a conclusion about it, deliberately, with the specific economy of motion that belongs to something that knows exactly where it is going and why. It was large. Larger than the wolves they had seen before. larger than the descriptions that circulated in the village's oral knowledge of the local wildlife, large in a way that made several of the adults recalibrate their immediate physical response, that instinctive, body-level recalculation that happens when something turns out to be bigger than your nervous system was prepared for. It placed itself between the group and the direction they were walking with a precision that could not have been accidental, not near the path, not adjacent to it, on it, occupying exactly the space they needed to pass through, positioned with a specificity that would have required, in a human, deliberate calculation. And then it was still. This stillness was, in the testimony of everyone who was there, the most disturbing element of the entire encounter. More disturbing than the size, more disturbing than the positioning, more disturbing than the fact of its presence at all, because the stillness was not the frozen stillness of an animal that is afraid and has not yet decided whether to flee or fight. It was the settled stillness of something that had nowhere else it needed to be. Complete, unhurried, entirely at ease with the confrontation in a way that made the confrontation itself feel somehow beside the point, as if the wolf were not meeting them in opposition so much as simply being present in a way that made their forward motion impossible. The group stopped. This was not a decision. Nobody said to stop. The stopping happened in the body before the mind had processed what it was responding to, that deep, pre-rational layer of human perception that knows certain things before the rational mind catches up. They stood there in the sharp morning, light, and looked at the wolf, and the wolf looked back at them, and the distance between them, perhaps 20 feet, perhaps less, felt to everyone present like something other than distance, like a threshold, like the edge of a different set of rules. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because what happened in the next several minutes is the part that cannot be explained away, the part that stayed in the bodies of the people who were there long after the rational mind had done its best work of explaining it. They tried to advance. Of course they did. These were not people who frightened easily. They were practical adults with a collective purpose and a collective will, and a single animal, however unusual its behavior, was not something that should have been able to stop them. One of them took a step forward. The wolf did not move, did not growl, did not shift into any of the postures of threat that would have given the step something to respond to. It simply remained, exactly as it was, and the person who had taken the step found that the step was all they took. Not because anything stopped them physically, because something stopped them in the place that is prior to physical, in the place where motivation lives, where intention generates action. The intention was there, the action did not follow. A second person tried, same result. Different person, same experience. The gap between intending to move forward and actually moving forward had opened into something that felt in the body like trying to push against a wall that had no surface. There was nothing to push against. There was simply an impossibility located precisely in the space between where they were and where they needed to go. The group began to talk among themselves in low voices. They discussed the animal. They discussed their options. They were reasonable people, and they went through the available reasonable responses with the thoroughness of people who have been trained by their community to solve problems through collective deliberation. Perhaps they should go around. They looked at the terrain on either side of the path. The wolf's eyes moved with them, not its body, its eyes, tracking the assessment with an attention that was, to every person present, absolutely legible. It knew what they were considering, and the knowing was communicated not through any action, but through the quality of its stillness, which deepened, fractionally, every time someone's eyes moved toward a possible alternative route, as if the stillness itself were a language and the message were, there is no way around this. One of them, the person who had been designated as the group's leader for this task, someone respected for his composure and his practical intelligence, made the decision to test the wolf directly. Not with aggression, but with the specific, measured assertion of a human being who understands that his species is not at the bottom of any hierarchy and who intends to communicate this clearly. He stepped forward slowly, with his eyes on the wolf's eyes and his posture carrying the full weight of his intention. He got closer than the others had. 3 steps, perhaps 4. And then he stopped, and something happened in his face that the people watching him from behind would describe later, with hesitation and with the particular care of people who know they are reporting something that sounds irrational. His expression changed. Not to fear. Not to the sharp, electric fear of a physical threat. To something more complex, something closer to the expression of a person who has just understood something they did not want to understand, who has reached the edge of a map they thought was complete and found that the territory continues beyond it. He stood there for a long moment without moving, and then he stepped back. 1 step, then another, and then he turned to the group and said nothing. He did not need to. The people watching him had seen what had happened in his face, and they had felt in that same moment their own versions of the same thing, that specific internal shift located somewhere below the sternum, where certainty used to be and where something else now lived. The wolf had not moved, had not threatened, had not performed any of the behaviors that would have given the situation a shape the village's experience could have accommodated. It had simply remained itself, fully and completely, in that space between them and what they had come to do. And in remaining itself, in refusing to be a problem that the village's existing tools could solve, it had done something to the group's collective sense of their own authority that none of them had a framework for processing. The confusion that descended on the group was not the simple confusion of an unexpected obstacle. It was the deeper confusion of people whose fundamental assumptions about how the world works have been quietly, irreversibly revised. They were people who believed, had always believed, had been raised inside a culture that confirmed this belief at every turn, that human decisions, made collectively, carried a force that the natural world was obliged to accommodate. That the authority of the group was the highest authority available in the circumstances of daily life. That when the community said this will happen, the only question was the logistics of the how, not the viability of the outcome. And now they were standing in a field in the sharp morning light, and the outcome was not happening, and the obstacle was a wolf that had not moved or threatened or done anything that fit the category of opposition, and the collective authority of the village felt, for the first time any of them could remember, like a story they had been telling themselves rather than a fact about the world. The fear that moved through the group was different from ordinary fear. It was not the fear of physical harm. The wolf had given them no reason. For that had performed none of the behaviors that animal fear is calibrated to respond to. It was the fear that comes when the ground shifts beneath a certainty, when something you organized your understanding of the world around turns out to be more conditional than you knew. When the rules you were living by reveal themselves to have a boundary you were not told about. Several people in the group were thinking about the child, not consciously, not in the way you think about something you are. Deliberately examining. But she was present in their thoughts the way a fact is present, unavoidably, insistently, in the particular way of something that has suddenly become very relevant to everything you are trying to understand. They were thinking about the quality of her stillness, and how it resembled in some way none of them wanted to name, the quality of the wolf's stillness. They were thinking about the way she had always seemed to occupy the space she was in without quite belonging to, the ordinary logic of the space. They were thinking, in the wordless language of bodily knowledge, about the possibility that what they had decided about her was not the whole story. The duality that presented itself to them in that field was not comfortable. On one side, everything the village had decided, the weight of the collective process, the social cost of reversing course, the specific discomfort of admitting that the confidence they had organized around was misplaced. On the other, a fire, wolf that would not move, an intention that would not become action, a morning that had arrived as one kind of story and was now clearly becoming a different one. The older members of the group, the ones whose age gave them access to a longer view of things, were the ones who felt the shift most clearly, because they had lived through enough reversals of expectation to recognize one when it was happening. They had seen enough of the world's quiet corrections to know that the world sometimes corrected in ways that were not interested in the convenience of the people being corrected. They had, somewhere in the layered experience of their years, the rudiment of an understanding that the younger people lacked. That authority is only as real as the circumstances that support it, and that circumstances were, in this moment, clearly not supporting the authority the village had assumed it possessed. One of the older women in the group said something. She said it quietly, to no one in particular, in the tone of someone thinking out loud rather than addressing the group. She said, "Perhaps we should understand what we are looking at before we decide what to do about it." It was a small thing to say. It did not resolve anything. It did not offer an alternative plan or provide a different framework for the morning's intentions, but it created, in the group's collective internal space, a small opening, a slight easing of the forward pressure that had been building since the decision was made, a fractional loosening of the certainty that had carried them to this point. And in that opening, doubt moved in. Not dramatic doubt, not the doubt of people who have changed their minds, the quiet, preliminary doubt of people who are beginning to wonder whether their minds were fully informed in the first place. The wolf watched them. This was not imagination, not the projection of a frightened group onto a neutral animal. Every person present felt the quality of its attention, the specific, oriented quality of a thing that was watching with understanding rather than instinct. Not watching them the way an animal watches a group of humans who have wandered too close. Watching them the way you watch a situation you are responsible for. With the particular combination of patience and alertness that belongs to someone who is present in a professional capacity, who is there because they are supposed to be there, because something brought them to exactly this place at exactly this time for a reason that is not accidental. The revelation that came to the group's designated leader, the man who had tried to advance and had stopped with that changed expression on his face, came not as a thought, but as a knowledge. The distinction matters. Thoughts arrive in language, in the sequential, arguable space of conscious reasoning. Knowledge arrives below that, in the body, in the place that processes certain kinds of information directly without passing them, through the filter of verbal articulation. What arrived in him was this: the decision was no longer theirs to execute. It might never have been theirs to make. He did not say this out loud. He did not need to. The knowledge was moving through the group with the speed and completeness of something that had been present all along, waiting only for the right conditions to become legible. It was visible in the way people's postures were changing, the slow, quiet deflation of bodies that have been carrying a purpose and are now gradually setting it down. Not in defeat, exactly. In something more complicated than defeat. In the specific quality of surrender that comes not from being overpowered, but from being shown something that cannot be unseen. The morning that had begun as the execution of a decision was becoming something else. A lesson, perhaps, or a correction, or simply an encounter with a truth that the village's process, however thorough, had failed to include in its calculations. The truth that certain things are not within the jurisdiction of collective human authority, that there are arrangements in the world that predate the village's traditions, predate the elders' wisdom, predate the whole architecture of human community and its confident self-governance. Arrangements that the village had not made and therefore could not unmake. The wolf remained in its position as the group began, slowly and without speaking, to move backward. Not running, there was. No panic in the withdrawal, no sudden release of accumulated fear. It was measured, deliberate. The retreat of people who are choosing to leave rather than being forced to, who are preserving in the manner of their going whatever dignity was available in circumstances that had stripped most of it away. They backed away from the threshold they had not been able to cross, and the wolf watched them go with the same quality of attention it had given them throughout, patient, present, without triumph or contempt. When they had gone far enough, it turned. Not immediately, not in the instant they stepped back. It gave them time, in a way that felt almost courteous, to complete their withdrawal before it released them from its attention. And then it turned toward the trees and walked back into them, and the space it had occupied on the path was empty again, ordinary, giving no evidence of what had just occurred there, except for the changed expressions of the people standing a distance, away, looking at each other with the particular look of people who have all witnessed the same impossible thing and are now engaged in the silent, collective work of deciding how to carry it. The silence that followed was not the silence of people with nothing to say. It was the silence of people with too much to say, and no language adequate to it. They stood in the field, and the morning continued its ordinary business around them, light moving, birds returning to their routines, the natural world resuming as if nothing had interrupted it, and the humans stood in the middle of all that ordinariness and felt the specific vertigo of people who have just had their map revised without consent. They went back to the village. What else could they do? The task was not completed. The task, it was becoming clear, could not be completed. Not because of the wolf. The wolf was already, in some of their minds, being filed into the available rational categories, being reduced to an unusual animal encounter that coincided unfortunately with their errand, but because of something that had happened inside them, in the space between intention and action, in the place where the wolf's stillness had located itself and refused to move. Something had shifted there that was not going to shift back. The village received them with the particular tension of people who have been waiting for news and can already read from the body language of the returning group that the news is not the news they expected. Questions were asked. Accounts were given. Carefully, selectively, each person editing their experience into the version they felt they could defend in front of their community without being thought irrational or afraid. The wolf was described, the encounter was described, the withdrawal was framed as a practical decision rather than a failure of will. They would try again, with different preparation, with a better approach. But in the private conversations that happened in the hours after, in the low voices of the people who had been there talking to each other away from the broader group, a different kind of accounting was taking place. People were comparing not just the external events, but the internal ones. The experience of standing at that threshold, of feeling the intention fail to become action, of watching one of their most reliable adults change expression in a way that none of the available rational explanations could fully account for. And in the comparing, the pattern that emerged was consistent enough to be disturbing. Everyone had felt the same thing. Not similar things, the same thing. Located in the same place in the body, arriving at the same moment, generating the same quality of stillness in the space between wanting to move and being able to. This consistency was the thing that could not be rationalized. An individual experience can be attributed to individual psychology, to fear, to imagination, to the distorting effects of expectation on perception. But a shared experience, identical in its essential structure across every person present, demands a different category, demands the acknowledgement that something was actually happening, something external to the individuals experiencing it, something that was generating that specific response in everyone who encountered it. The older woman who had spoken in the field said it most clearly in the private conversation she had with the village's head elder that evening. She said, whatever that animal was doing, it was not behaving like an animal. And whatever it was protecting, it was not protecting it the way animals protect their territory or their young. It was protecting it the way something protects something it has been entrusted with. As if the child were not just a child it had chosen to defend, but something it was responsible for in a way that went beyond choice. The elder listened to this without speaking for a long time. He was very old enough to have heard stories that the current generation had filed under legend and moved past, stories about the kinds of arrangements that existed in the world before human communities became large enough and confident enough to forget that the world's organization preceded and exceeded their own. He had heard those stories with the half-attention of a man who believed in the practical world and found the old narratives charming but not quite credible. He was hearing them differently now. He said, Then we made a decision about something we did not fully understand. And she said, we made a decision about something that was never entirely ours to decide about. And the distinction between those two statements, subtle in their language, enormous in their implications, hung between them in the evening air and settled into both of them as a truth they would carry for the rest of their lives. The village did not make a second attempt. This was not announced, not formalized, not discussed in the open gathering that had produced the original decision. It happened the way things happen when a group of people collectively and silently revises a position without wanting to explicitly acknowledge that the revision is occurring. People stopped talking about the plan. The subject, which had dominated the village's conversations for weeks, quietly withdrew from general circulation. The task that had been assigned was not reassigned. The morning in the field was not officially revisited or reanalyzed. It was, in the specific way that communities handle things they cannot integrate into their existing frameworks, absorbed into a silence that was itself a kind of answer. The child remained. And this is where the hidden truth of the whole situation begins to reveal itself. The truth that the village could not arrive at through its process because the process was not designed to ask the right questions. The question the village had been asking was, does she belong here? Should she stay or go? Is her presence compatible with our coherence? These were questions framed entirely in the language of human authority, human judgment, human decision-making. They assumed from the beginning that the relevant jurisdiction was the village's, that the village was the body empowered to make this determination, and that the only real question was what determination it would make. But the morning in the field had introduced, wordlessly and irresistibly, a different question. Not should she stay, but who decides? Not is she compatible with us, but what is she actually, and what kind of understanding would we need in order to make any meaningful judgment about her at all? The wolf had not argued against the village's decision. It had not offered a counter-argument, had not presented evidence for the other side, had not engaged with the village's reasoning on its own terms. It had simply demonstrated, through the completeness of its presence, that the village's reasoning was operating in a jurisdiction smaller than the one actually in play. The transformation that occurred in the village after that morning was not dramatic. It was the slow, uncomfortable transformation of a community that has encountered the edges of its own competence and must now figure out how to incorporate that encounter into its ongoing self-understanding. Some people processed it by minimizing, by reducing the event to an unusual animal encounter and declining to extract any broader meaning from it. Some processed it through the framework of the supernatural, assigning the wolf to a spiritual category that explained the event, but also, in some ways, closed off further inquiry by making it too large and too mysterious to engage with practically. Some few processed it the hard way, by sitting with the discomfort of genuine uncertainty, by allowing the event to revise not just their conclusions about this specific situation, but their underlying assumptions about the nature of their own authority. The head elder was in this last group, and in the months after that morning, he did something that the village found unusual, but did not oppose. He began to pay very different attention to the child. Not the wary, assessing attention that the village had been giving her for years. A different kind. The kind of attention you give to something when you have realized that your previous understanding of it was inadequate, and you are genuinely trying to understand it better. He watched her without agenda. He let what he saw arrive without the filter of what he expected or feared to see. What he saw changed him. Not because it was dramatic. It was not. She was still the child she had always been, still quiet, still inhabiting the edges of the social world, still carrying that quality of attentive stillness that had made the village so uncomfortable. But he began to see those qualities differently, not as absences, not as the failure to be loud, the failure to be social, the failure to conform to the template of a child in good standing with her community. As presences, as specific, positive qualities that had their own logic, their own function, their own relationship to the world that he had not previously been equipped to read. He began to think about the wolf. He thought about it the way you think about something that has instructed you, not with fear, not with the reverence you reserve for the supernatural, but with the specific respect you give to a teacher who has shown you something real. He thought about the quality of its stillness, and he looked at the child's stillness, and he allowed himself, for the first time, to consider that they might be related. Not metaphorically. Actually related. That the quality he had witnessed in the wolf, that specific settled quality of something that knows its purpose and is completely at peace with it, was present in the child, because the child was the purpose. Because she was the reason for the accompaniment. Because whatever she was, whatever she carried, whatever frequency she moved through the world generating, it was something that called that quality forth. That required that quality in response. He could not have said any of this in the village gathering without being met with the specific kind of dismissal reserved for people who have decided to take seriously the things that serious people dismiss, so he kept it mostly internal. But it changed his behavior in ways that were visible without being explained. He stopped speaking about the child in the language of the problem she represented. He began, very quietly, to speak about her in a different register, not to the whole village, not in formal contexts, but in the individual conversations that shape a community's understanding as powerfully as any official discussion. And the village slowly began to shift, not toward understanding her. Understanding was too large a project, too dependent on frameworks they did not have, toward something smaller but significant, toward leaving her alone, toward a kind of uneasy respect that did not require comprehension, toward the acceptance, never formally stated, that whatever she was and whatever surrounded her, it was not something the village's authority extended to, that she existed in a jurisdiction that was not theirs. The forced acceptance was not peace. It was not the warm, generous acceptance of a community that has genuinely expanded its understanding of who belongs. It was the grudging, uncomfortable acceptance of people who have tried to impose their will and discovered that the imposition is not available to them, that the door they reached for is locked in a way they cannot pick, from a side they cannot access. But in that grudging, uncomfortable acceptance, in that pulled-back, hands-off posture the village adopted toward her after the morning in the field, something became possible for the child that had not been possible before. Space. The specific kind of space that opens when people stop trying to determine what you are and simply, however reluctantly, let you be. She did not immediately flower into it. The years of low-grade exclusion had done their work, and recovery from that kind of damage is slow and non-linear. But the pressure lifted. The active quality of the village's attention toward her shifted from the assessing, categorizing, problem-solving attention of people trying to resolve something into the watchful but non-interfering attention of people who have decided, for reasons they don't fully understand, to let something be. And in that lifting of pressure, in that slight easing of the ongoing effort to be something legible to people whose framework could not accommodate what she actually was, she began, very slowly, very quietly, to come into herself. Not in the grand, transformative way of stories that need their protagonist to arrive visibly and dramatically into their power. In the ordinary, daily way of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time and is now finally allowing themselves to breathe. The accompaniment continued. It had never interrupted, never paused, never been dependent on the village's approval or disapproval for its orientation toward her. But she felt it differently now. Before the morning in the field, she had known it in the way she knew her own heartbeat, always present, always real, but operating below the threshold of conscious attention. Because there was too much else demanding attention. After the morning in the field, in the new and slightly larger space the village's withdrawal had created, she could feel it more clearly, could be more present to it, could for the first time begin to develop a conscious relationship with something that had previously been only a felt sense, a background knowing, the unnamed companion of her entire life. She began to go to the tree line in the evenings, not with any particular intention, not with any framework for what she was doing. simply because it was the direction she felt drawn, and because she was, for the first time in her life, in a position where following the feeling did not require defending the feeling to anyone. She would sit at the edge of the trees as the light changed and simply be there, and the quality of the space around her would shift in the way she had learned to recognize. That specific deepening of attention, that sense of the air becoming more present to itself, that feeling of being accompanied that was, to her, as familiar and reliable as the ground beneath her. Sometimes she saw it. Not always. Not in the way of a domestic animal that appears reliably on schedule, but in the way of something that moves according to its own logic and allows itself to be seen when it chooses. A shape in the deepening shadow, the specific weight of a gaze coming from the direction of the darkness between the trees. Occasionally, clearly, the wolf, sitting at the boundary of the light with its characteristic stillness, looking at her with those eyes that she had stopped trying to read in human terms and had learned to simply receive as they were. Not as messages, as presence, as the specific quality of attention of something that is simply completely purposefully there. She did not speak to it. It did not communicate in any way that required decoding. The communication that happened between them, and she would say years later that it was the most significant communication of her life, happened in the register below language, in the body, in the nervous system, in the place where the most fundamental kinds of knowing are stored and transmitted. What it gave her, in those evenings at the tree line, was not information. It was confirmation. The ongoing, consistent, wordless confirmation that what she was not wrong, that the sensitivity the village had pathologized, the quietness they had diagnosed as a deficiency, the particular way she was oriented toward the world, none of it was a problem to be solved. All of it was exactly what it needed to be. This confirmation, delivered not once but repeatedly over the months and years of those evenings, did something to the structure of her self-understanding that no human reassurance could have done, because it came from something that was not operating from the same interests and assumptions as the village. It came from something that had no stake in her conforming, no investment in her becoming more useful or more legible or more comfortable for the people around her. It came from something that knew what she was without the filter of what it needed her to be. And that quality of knowing, unfiltered, unmediated, simply accurate, was the most nourishing thing she had ever received. The village watched this in the way that the village always watched, from a careful distance with the specific quality of attention that is managed rather than open. They did not interfere. They had learned in the field on that sharp morning that interference in this particular space was not something they were equipped for, but they watched and they registered, and the watching changed them further, almost imperceptibly, almost against their will, but continuously. The sight of her at the tree line and the quality of the space around her in those moments kept doing what the morning in the field had started, kept revising the map, kept introducing, quietly and persistently, the evidence that their understanding of this child had been built on a category error so fundamental that correcting it required more than updating a conclusion. It required rebuilding the framework that had produced the conclusion in the first place. This rebuilding is the work that takes the longest. It is the work that most communities never complete, because it requires the admission of a kind of wrongness that goes deeper than specific errors, the admission that the way of seeing itself was flawed, not just the things seen through it. This is the work that produces genuine transformation, not the adjustment of conclusions, but the revision of the lens. And it is slow, and it is uncomfortable, and it requires encounters with things like that morning in the field, things that are not interested in your comfort or your convenience, that place themselves directly in the path of what you are sure you are about to do and simply refuse to accommodate your certainty. The child had been the occasion for that work in the village, not its cause, not its agent, simply the occasion. The thing whose presence had created the conditions for the encounter that was necessary. And she would continue to be that occasion, not through any intention of her own, Not because she was trying to change the village or teach it anything, but because she could not be anything other than what she was, and what she was kept creating the conditions for exactly the kind of encounter that the village needed. This is one of the hidden truths about people who carry what she carried, people who are accompanied in the way she was accompanied, who exist in the specific relationship with the world's invisible structure that she existed in. They do not set out to be transformative. They do not choose their impact. Their impact is a byproduct of their presence, of the simple, ongoing fact of being fully what they are in spaces that are not accustomed to that kind of fullness. The transformation they generate in others is not something they do. It is something that happens in response to them, the way a tuning fork responds to a note it is calibrated for. She was the note. The village was the tuning fork. And the resonance between them, uncomfortable, disorienting, ultimately unavoidable, was the process through which the village was being changed, through which certain things it had been sure of were being gently but irresistibly unmade, and certain things it had never considered were being introduced into the space left behind. Write in the comments, "She could never be taken." Let those words sit with you for a moment before you scroll past. Because what you have just heard is not only her story. If you are still here, if you rode this all the way to the end, then you already know that this was not just a story about a child and a wolf and a village that got something wrong. You felt it land somewhere more personal than that. In the part of you that has been called too much or not enough or simply difficult to place. In the part that has wondered quietly whether the things that make you different from the people around you are liabilities or something else entirely. That is exactly the kind of question this channel exists to sit with, not to answer too quickly, not to wrap up neatly, but to take seriously, to give the space and the depth it deserves. If that is the conversation you want to keep having, then subscribe. Turn on the notifications. Because the next time something like this arrives here, you deserve to be present for it from the beginning. And before you move on, drop something in the comments. Just this: I made it to the end. That is all. It tells me you are here, that this reached you, and it reaches the next person who scrolls down and needs to know that someone else stayed all the way through something that asked something real of them. If this video moved through you the way I hope it did, if it shifted something even slightly, then a like is simply your quiet way of saying, this kind of story matters. One tap, that is enough. And there is a video right beside this one that picks up exactly where this feeling lives, that goes further into the territory we just opened together. Click on it. Come with me. What comes next is worth the extra few minutes, and you will understand why the moment it begins.